Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. We're talking about the Garissa attacks in the company of France 24 correspondent Duncan Woodside in Nairobi, Christine Mungai, reporter for The Mail and Guardian, Roland Marchal, who does research at the French National Research Center, the CNRS, and follows all of the Horn of Africa for us, and Leslie Levkoff, Deputy Africa Director for Human Rights Watch, who joins us today from Amsterdam in the Netherlands. Duncan Woodside, you sat down with one survivor from the Garissa University attack. His name is Gibsi Njoroge, and he described his escape. Let's take a listen.
About the bodies, I didn't count. You are jumping. You see, I was running. You are stepping on some, you see, he's full of blood. Maybe he's not dead, but you have to step on him. If you don't and hesitate, you shot. So there's this friend of mine, he was shot at the leg. But I didn't know. I was focused at running. He was shot twice. Then was shot at the head. You see, he was saying, now that's when he shouted, "I'm dying," screaming, "You are dying." So I looked back. So when I saw him, you couldn't run anymore. So I fell down. A soldier, one of the soldiers, he threw a rope at me. He told me, tie yourself anywhere, somewhere. So I tied it myself, around myself, and hooked at my arms. And he pulled me next to the wall. A bullet hit the wall. And I was like, was that bullet was meant to kill me. The soldier looked at me and told me, you are one lucky kid. Every week I had to tell my father, I'm not safe here, I don't feel safe. I wasn't alone. It wasn't only me. Everybody was complaining.
I didn't feel safe. Duncan Woodside, a lot of food for thought in that description by that brave 19-year-old. And he mentioned, of course, that Kenyan soldier who helped him escape.
That's right, yes. Obviously, this is an important point to talk about, I think, as much as the Kenyan security forces are being vilified at home and also abroad in terms of their response to this crisis and also the wider crisis that's affecting Kenya. There are many people within the security structures who have been doing quite an incredible job, and obviously the soldier that helped Gibsi there is just one example. I think there needs to be a recognition of the fact that there are people in Kenya within the various arms of the security forces who, despite this culture of corruption, which makes things so difficult, they're doing a good job. And these individuals, groups of individuals, have actually successfully stopped some attacks. That's not just according to the authorities here. We've had that corroborated by other security sources, non-governmental security sources, international sources here on the ground. So obviously Kenya is very much at the front line of this fight against an al-Qaeda affiliate. In many ways they're doing the West's bidding in Somalia, and because they're so close to Somalia, there is inevitably a disproportionate amount of blowback that's being felt within Kenya itself compared to other countries, including those other countries which contribute to the peace enforcement mission in Somalia. So, for example, Uganda and Burundi, they don't share a common border with Somalia, so they've escaped relatively unscathed. There's been nothing in Burundi at all. There's been no attacks inside Burundi, despite al-Shabaab threats. Uganda, of course, has been more affected, but not as much as Kenya. Partially, of course, that does reflect the fact that in Burundi there's not a significant amount of domestic radicalization, so it's very difficult for operatives to find sanctuary within local communities. Uganda as well, there's less radicalization than Kenya and arguably less corruption at the same time. But Kenya, yeah, very much at the forefront of this Western-sponsored battle.
And Duncan, I was going to ask you, because last week you were saying that hot on the heels of the attack, there were some in the opposition that were starting to doubt whether it was right for Kenya to be in Somalia. Is that still the case today?
A few months ago, the main leader of the opposition, Raila Odinga, said that the Kenyan troops ought to be pulled out of Somalia. That was his position. So obviously that runs contradictory to the position of Uhuru Kenyatta's government. He's reaffirmed that Kenyan troops, who said this many times, Kenyan troops will remain in Somalia until the government and the wider international community feels that the job is done. Raila Odinga, though, since this latest attack, has not been in combative form in terms of what he's been saying. He's actually said that at this particular time it's very important for all political forces to pull together to solve this problem that Kenya has. So there's been no criticism that I'm aware of since the Garissa attack, although perhaps once the families have been able to bury their loved ones, the opposition will reassert itself and start asking big questions again about the preparedness of the security forces and also the wider strategy of being in Somalia in the first place.
The wider strategy when it comes to Somalia. Roland Marchal, when we were talking about this last week, you were saying it's kind of the same problem as Afghanistan, where you have this force that you're fighting, you're branding them terrorists. At some point, somewhere down the line, you're going to have to sit down with them.
Yeah, well, you make peace only with your enemies, certainly. My point is, the Kenyans, they have to address one difficult issue. They sent troops in Somalia to secure the border 3.5 years after. The border is more dangerous than any time before they sent troops. So is it a problem of performance? Is it because the Kenyan troops in Kismayo, in Somalia, they are making business more than anything else? Or is it an issue of policy? And this is certainly the question they should discuss today in Nairobi. I doubt that is going to be the case, but I believe that is the real discussion should be on that point, because then you could maybe reframe the policy, maybe keep your troops there, but doing other things than what they are doing today. But I understand that no one has the political imagination to move into that direction on one side. On the other side, there are so many economic interests linked to the Kenyan presence in southern Somalia today that I doubt that many in the political elites will move, just against the mainstream to just challenge a failure.
All right, we're talking about an Al-Qaeda-affiliated group. These are hardline Sunni militants. Christine Mungai, should Kenyan troops be in Somalia?
That's a difficult question. When Kenya went into Somalia, this was in October of 2011. It was because Al-Shabaab had been kidnapping tourists inside Kenya. So that was the thing that prompted Kenya to go into Somalia to push them back, so that we can secure our borders and our territorial sovereignty and our national security. But like the other panelists said, that 2.5 years later, almost 3.5 years later, I think we've really lost the focus of why we were there. And what worries me is that it seems like our government doesn't have an exit strategy. I think for any military to engage, across its borders or in any military operation, there has to be an end game. There has to be an exit strategy at the end of it. There has to be something that you say, okay, this is what we do when we achieve our mission, or this is what we do when we don't. Because, right now it just seems very open-ended, and like someone else has rightly said, there's a lot of business and profits, being made in Somalia. A lot of our Kenyan soldiers have been implicated in that. And so there's a perverse incentive to remain there and not really to fulfill, the ultimate mission, which was to secure Kenya. Because, as someone has said, that the borders are more porous, more dangerous, northeastern provinces, more dangerous than it has ever been. And so it really worries me when I don't see even an indication of what the exit strategy would be. That's what I would want to see. And with that, we're able to, hold our government accountable and to say, look, these are the key points that we wanted to achieve, and this is how far we've gone. But right now, it's very blurred, it's very open-ended, And so, you know, sort of anything goes. So we have no way of gauging if we're making progress or not, if we should be there or not. If, you know.
Yeah, I was going to say, let's listen now to some of the political leaders inside of Kenya. We invited the ambassador to be with us. They did not follow through on that invitation, unfortunately. The majority leader in Kenya's parliament happens to be from Garissa, Aden Duale. He's calling for full disclosure. Let's listen.
They must tell the security agents who among us are the financiers of the Al-Shabaab. Who among us are sympathizers of Al-Shabaab? Who among us are the logisticians, those who do logistics for Al-Shabaab?
All right, they have to tell us who among us. Kenya's president also trying to, as we were saying in part one of our discussion, follow the money with this clampdown, which has been criticized on money transfers and the likes and the freezing of assets. Kenya's president, who also is looking for the enemy within.
It is a fact that our task of countering terrorism work has been made all the more difficult by the fact that the planners and financiers of this brutality are deeply embedded in our communities and were seen previously as ordinary, harmless people. We will not allow them to continue their lives as normal. The full force of the law will be brought to bear with even greater intensity than has been the case in previous years.
People seen previously as ordinary, harmless people. Leslie Lefkoff, what's your reaction to that?
Well, I'd like to see the evidence. What grounds have they used for selecting these people, these institutions? I mean, I think there's a huge number of questions about how they're identifying these people. And those are questions, frankly, that are raised often when it comes to incidents, security incidents in Kenya. How do the intelligence and security forces identify the suspects, and what do they do in terms of prosecuting them? Because there's a long history here of failed prosecutions of terrorism suspects who, you know, sometimes turn out to be innocent people who've been arbitrarily detained and held for long periods, sometimes abused. So the record here of actually identifying the right people and taking the right action against them is not a very good one, which is, you know, a huge challenge. I don't think we can't underestimate the challenge, but I think that the first thing that really needs to happen is to look clearly at the failures that are well documented in many cases, and really have the political will to address them. And I think that's the key question.
But Leslie, let me ask you, when you hear President Kenyatta speak, do you get the sense that he's heeding the call?
I'm not sure, because I think, as I said, that, you know, until we see a real willingness, political will, to undertake the kinds of reforms that are needed of the security services, it's hard to see them performing in a substantially better way. And I haven't actually seen that political will demonstrated. I haven't seen the president and the leadership of Kenya saying, we recognize that corruption and impunity and a lack of accountability are fundamental problems that are impeding the way that we're reacting to this security crisis.
All right, we've been talking about Kenya's reaction. We're going to look now at the international reaction. For that, it's time for our Media Watch segment. And we say hello to James Creedon. How are you, sir?
Good evening, Francois. Very well. And indeed, we've... Yes.
I was going to say, there's been a big outcry, and you've been talking about it in the past few days on social media. Why is there less indignation over Kenya than over the Tunis attacks, over the Paris attacks, over the destruction of antiquities in Syria and Iraq?
That's right. All of those questions being asked since the weekend, really, on social media, Francois. One of the hashtags that has been, just to focus, first of all, I suppose, on the victims themselves. I think the themes tend to overlap in any case. Hashtag 147, not just a number. That's been widely used over the last 4 or 5 days on social media, putting a name and a face to the victims. For example, Angela Kimata was a friend, one of the most beautiful humans you'll ever meet. Rather, 147, not just a number. Tobias, he died in the Garissa attack. To us, he's not a number. He's a son, a brother, and a friend, and there was a huge proliferation of those tweets putting a name and a face to the victims. This Peter Masinde, who was 32 and his wife was pregnant, he was the first officer shot on site. So really, it brings it home, doesn't it, Francois, when you see a name and a face and some sort of a detail about somebody's life, that this was a huge, huge tragedy. And you can see also the hashtag Day of Names being used in the same theme. And I suppose the idea really was, we're naming them, we're putting an identity on the victims, because the international media hasn't really done a good enough job at putting the spotlight on the tragic aspect of the story. That was really one of the reasons I think this hashtag came forth, and you can see their images as well, 147 in the shape of a gun, I suppose, to really hammer that point home. Garissa attack, 147 killed in the West, says reported.ly. Would we be so quick to forget? So you're seeing there that theme coming through. African Lives Matter also being used as a hashtag there, Francois, on that.
Would we be so quick to forget? Christine Mungai, what are your thoughts on international reaction or lack thereof?
For me, the international reaction is not my primary concern. What worries me is the Kenyan reaction, and we've talked about that. So, as Kenyans, we're not really looking, outside to see what other people are saying about us and how they're reacting to this. But having said that, what really strikes me as curious and, a bit sad is that time and time again, we've seen the international reaction be more acute when antiquities are are under attack or at risk or something like that. Like in 2012, when northern Mali was taken over by some jihadist groups, and one of the things that they really wanted to do was to burn down the ancient books of Timbuktu. And the reaction was just, it was wild. People went crazy about that. And it's the ancient scripts of Timbuktu are wonderful, historical treasures, and they're part of the world's cultural heritage. But I just wonder why so much over that and not so much over real life human beings. And that's I find that really sad. But ultimately, our responsibility to our own security, that's our Kenyan responsibility. We're not really looking, I'm not really looking at the world to see how they're going to handle this, how they're going to sort it out.
Roland Marchal.
Yeah, 2 points. One is, what is very striking is the fact that African states did not react the way they should have, compared to what happened in France with Charlie Hebdo, and even compared to what happened in Mali. So this is a political weakness in front of terrorism that has to be challenged. And the second point is...
So, for instance, should we have seen the leaders of neighboring states that are participating in Somalia, like Ethiopia and Uganda?
Maybe going to Kenya, visiting Garissa, proving that they share the concerns, they share the pain of the Kenyans, and so on, showing solidarity at a very difficult moment for the Kenyan society. This did not happen. On the other side, what we could say, and I'm not saying it's the explanation, but certainly the Kenyan state has a way to manage its international cooperation on terrorism that is difficult to understand. He's calling for the US, the Brits, to get involved, and at the same time he blamed those countries because they are warning their citizens that actually some places in Kenya are quite dangerous. So maybe Kenya has to get a much better diplomacy if he wants to have more recognition from his partners in Africa and outside, and then, of course, much better efficiency to fight terrorism.
That was a point you were mentioning, Duncan Woodside, last week, which was hours before the attack, the president had discarded a travel warning issued by the UK and Australia.
Yes, obviously very unfortunate timing there in terms of the president's choosing to speak out on that issue. Obviously, there are frustrations in Kenya that they're so subject to or so vulnerable to the effect of such travel advisories. The tourism industry in Kenya has taken an absolute beating.
All right, we've lost the connection, but of course, tourism is an issue.
Have tourists in Nairobi, landing in Nairobi, and a quarter of the tourists landing in Mombasa. So it's a collapse. And that will have deep impact on the cost. I mean, maybe contributing to radicalization on one side, and of course, in macroeconomic terms, that's going to be a disaster for Kenya.
And that doesn't justify the statements of the president. Perhaps it explains them, though.
Yeah, well, you know, again, why he has taken so long to react, why there is not overall of the security services in this country, questions that Lefty raised just before, are questions that are still on the agenda, on the top of the agenda in Kenya, and we don't see the right answers right now, especially after these decisions made in a very fast manner without deep thinking. They are going the wrong way.
Leslie Lekvo, the fact is that the attack has happened. The international community, should it be reaching out more than it is to Kenya?
Well, I mean, I'm sure that the international community is reaching out. I mean, you know, a number of there's a lot of countries, governments with very strong partnerships with Kenya, particularly on the security front. There's support for the Kenyan anti-terrorism police unit from, just to name a couple, from the United States and the UK governments. I mean, I don't know all the details of what form that support takes, but there certainly are strong partnerships with Kenya by a number of Western governments on the terrorism front. And I think that those partnerships can be a force for good or potentially a force that's problematic, because in some cases, I think those partnerships mean that donor governments and Western governments overlook some of the very serious human rights concerns that we and other groups are raising, because the counterterrorism concerns trump all other interests. So I think that, you know, I would certainly hope that in the dialogue that's taking place between the Kenyan and other governments, those concerns are being raised, and that there are real lessons learned also from the experiences of many other countries, including Western countries, in dealing with terrorism, and the experience that having a knee-jerk reaction to try to, for example, curb human rights is not the answer to improving security.
James Creedon?
Well, just to add to some of the points that have been made by the guests online, I suppose the global response on social media in any case has been to pick up on the refrain that we saw after the Paris attacks, Je suis Charlie, and to apply it to what happened in Kenya for whatever effect that it might have. It might just be a lot of hot air online, I don't know, but at least the sentiments are being expressed, Je suis Kenya, and that's picking up. That is an article that is shared there from a Libération newspaper, which asks the question, are Kenyans condemned to die in indifference? There was also I am Kenyan being shared across social media with images such as this. So I suppose social media users, as I said, maybe the effects of this are minimal, Francois, but it is certainly a case. They are sentiments that are being expressed on social media, and I think a lot of people saying that in the aftermath of the huge global outpouring of support and disgust in the aftermath of the Paris attacks, with Je suis Charlie becoming one of the most used hashtags of all time, that what happened in Kenya did seem to not generate anything like the same response.
Christine Mungai, we saw obviously what happened in 2013 with the Westgate Mall siege. We saw that there was this steady stream of attacks by Shabab militants, and now that's happened at Garissa University. How is your nation going to be different in a way from now on?
I really hope that this, at least, if nothing else, it serves as as a wake-up call, in the sense that it's now time to be ashamed of our failings. It's now time to say, no, we can't go on like this anymore. Because, I feel like our government is just united in denial about this thing. And mostly it's because a lot of people in the public service benefit from these weaknesses. So there's no incentive to strengthen our institutions. Sometimes even, what looks like reform on the surface is actually, there are loopholes and weaknesses built into the system, just so that
pressure is on now.
I would say the pressure is building. I don't think it's reached tipping point yet, but I think the public pressure is definitely building, and it's gonna be difficult to just continue, business as usual. If we're a country where people can be hunted down in their hostels, that's just, it's unbearable even to think about.
All right, I want to thank you for that, Christine Mungai, for joining us from Nairobi. I want to thank Duncan Woodside as well, our correspondent who is in the Kenyan capital. Also want to thank Leslie Lekvo of Human Rights Watch for being with us from Amsterdam, Roland Marchal, and our own James Creedon. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.